Hey y'all, it's entry number 30 of this off-season series where we discuss a different player's fantasy value each day as a group. We are another day closer to the start of the 2022 NFL season. Each day we'll drop a name, go through some positives and some concerns of their fantasy profile, and then I'll give my personal opinion at the end. Today's discussion will be on Justin Jefferson, wide receiver, Minnesota Vikings. We'll start with some of the positives from Justin Jefferson's fantasy profile. To start, we're going to talk about his incredible start to his career. Justin Jefferson holds the record for the most receiving yards by a player during their first two NFL seasons according to StatMuse, with 3,016. Over the course of his young career, he's averaged 5.94 receptions on 8.85 targets for 91.4 receiving yards and 0.52 receiving touchdowns per game, according to Pro Football Reference, and he's finished as a top 6 fantasy wide receiver in each of his first two seasons in the league. He's clearly a special talent that can put up big numbers on the stat sheet. The next thing I really liked about Justin Jefferson's fantasy profile is his air yards. During the 2021 season, Justin Jefferson averaged 123.9 air yards per game, 2.18 air yards per snap, and had 45.8% of his team's air yards, which were among the best marks in the league according to RotoWire. According to Player Profiler, Justin Jefferson had 1,996 air yards, first in the NFL among receivers, and 867 unrealized air yards, 8th among wide receivers, during the 2021 season. These air yards and unrealized air yards show what kind of ceiling Jefferson has and suggest that there may be even more room for him to grow. The last major positive I like from Justin Jefferson's fantasy profile is his efficiency. During the 2021 season, Justin Jefferson averaged 2.76 yards per route run, the 6th best among wide receivers, 9.7 yards per target, the 12th best among wide receivers, 0.56 fantasy points per route run, the 8th best among wide receivers, 1.98 fantasy points per target, 20th best among wide receivers, according to Player Profiler. This wasn't a fluke, as he was similarly efficient during his rookie season, as he averaged 2.65 yards per route run, 5th best among wideouts, 11.2 yards per target, 5th best among wideouts, 0.52 fantasy points per route run, 7th best among wideouts, and 2.19 fantasy points per target, 12th best among wideouts according to Player Profiler. Because he is so efficient every time he gets an opportunity, it makes it more likely that the Vikings feature him as frequently as possible in the passing game. Moving on to some of the concerns with Justin Jefferson's fantasy profile. To start, we'll talk about his 2021 contested catch rate. Justin Jefferson caught just 33.3% of contested passes his way in 2021, which ranked 57th best among wide receivers according to Player Profiler. The next concern I have with Justin Jefferson's fantasy profile is his 2021 drop rate. According to RotoWire, Justin Jefferson posted a drop rate of 6.0% in 2021, which was below average for a wideout. According to Player Profiler, Justin Jefferson had 11 drops during the 2021 season, which was the most among wide receivers. The last concern I have with Justin Jefferson's fantasy profile is a bit of a weird one, but it's about the potential improvements to the Minnesota Vikings defense. During the 2021 season, the Minnesota Vikings defense ranked 30th in yards given up per game, with 383.6, and 24th in points allowed per game, with 25.1 according to ESPN. In addition, during the 2020 season, the Minnesota Vikings ranked 27th in yards given up per game with 393.3 and 29th in points allowed per game with 29.7 according to ESPN. They've clearly had one of the worst defenses in the league the last couple of seasons, but there's more optimism for the Vikings defense in 2022. They have a new defensive coordinator in Ed Donatel, who has been an above-average defensive coordinator at his previous stops. Danielle Hunter is expected to be healthy after struggling with injuries the past two seasons. They signed Zadarius Smith, who had 26 sacks from 2019 to 2020 according to Pro Football Reference, drafted Lewis Cine in the first round of the 2022 draft at 32nd overall, cornerback Andrew Booth in the second round, and linebacker Brian Asamoah in the third round. You may be wondering, how exactly does this impact Justin Jefferson? Well, it's looking like the Minnesota Vikings will have the best defense they've had since they've drafted Jefferson, which means that there could be fewer pass-friendly game scripts for the team in 2022, and potentially cause a slight dip in volume for Jefferson in 2022. Some additional thoughts on Justin Jefferson. Coaching changes. The Minnesota Vikings will have a brand new coaching staff in 2022, led by their newest head coach, Kevin O'Connell. O'Connell has previously worked as an offensive coordinator in Washington and Los Angeles, and has recently been a part of offense that do a good job of featuring and getting production out of their wide receivers. Reliable quarterback. In each of the last 7 years, Vikings starting quarterback Kirk Cousins has thrown 25 touchdowns or more. In 6 of the last 7 years, he's had over 4,000 passing yards. Having a statistically solid quarterback will help Jefferson put up decent fantasy numbers. During the 2021 season, in total fantasy points, Justin Jefferson finished as the WR4 in standard with 222.4 total fantasy points and 13.1 fantasy points per game, the WR4 in half PPR formats with 276.4 total fantasy points and 16.3 fantasy points per game, and the WR4 in full PPR formats with 330.4 total fantasy points and 19.4 fantasy points per game, according to Fantasy Pros. During the 2020 season, Justin Jefferson was the WR6 in standard with 186.2 total fantasy points, 11.6 fantasy points per game, the WR6 in half PPR formats with 230.2 total fantasy points and 14.4 fantasy points per game, and the WR6 in full PPR formats with 274.2 total fantasy points and 17.1 fantasy points per game, according to Fantasy Pros. During the 2021 season in half PPR formats, Justin Jefferson had 1 out of 17 games with 0 to 5 fantasy points, 1 out of 17 games with 5 to 9.9 fantasy points, 4 out of 17 games with 10 to 15 fantasy points, 8 out of 17 games with 15 to 20 fantasy points, 1 out of 17 games with 20 to 30 fantasy points, and 2 out of 17 games with over 30 fantasy points, according to fantasy data. During the 2020 season in half PPR formats, Justin Jefferson had 3 out of 16 games with 0 to 5 fantasy points, 3 out of 16 games with 5 to 10 fantasy points, 3 out of 16 games with 10 to 15 fantasy points, 3 out of 16 games with 15 to 20 fantasy points, 2 out of 16 games with 20 to 25 fantasy points, and 2 out of 16 games with over 25 fantasy points, according to Fantasy Pros. Red zone usage. Justin Jefferson saw 26 red zone targets, 7th best in the NFL during the 2021 season, and 14 red zone targets, 53rd best in the NFL in 2020, according to NFL Savant. Yards after the catch. Justin Jefferson had 482 yards after the catch in 2021, which ranked 12th in the NFL according to Pro Football Reference. In 2020, Justin Jefferson had 453 yards after the catch, which ranked 14th in the NFL according to Pro Football Reference. Personal opinion. Justin Jefferson is currently going off the board as WR2 about pick 6 overall on ESPN and WR2 about pick 9 overall on Yahoo. The WR2 ranking seems appropriate, and I have him ranked as a top 4 player overall personally. He's a superstar that doesn't really have any major flaws in his fantasy profile. He's young, efficient, has a reliable quarterback, will see a ton of volume, and has yet to miss a game at the NFL level. You won't find many players safer than Jefferson in your drafts, and he has a very strong chance to finish as the number 1 fantasy wide receiver in 2022. You should feel good about taking Jefferson in the first round of your drafts, so don't force yourself into picking a running back you don't believe if Jefferson is still there. For each of these entries, we will highlight a charitable cause or organization. Justin Jefferson's My Cause My Cleats in 2021 was for the Northside Achievement Zone, which exists to permanently close the achievement gap and end generational poverty in North Minneapolis. Here's a link to that organization below. And that's it for today's entry. If you enjoyed today's entry, be sure to like and subscribe.